Jan, thank you so much for joining me on this new philosophy podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to dive straight in to talk about our question for today, which is, what is reality / are we living in a simulation? So we've got very appropriate backgrounds, as you guys can see. All good philosophers define their terms, first of all. They think about what the terms in the question actually mean. We're going to go down that classic philosophical route. So should we start by thinking about what is reality? Like, what do we mean when we use the word reality?
So for me, I feel like reality has two sides, objective and subjective. When we usually say reality in an objective way, that is a world that objectively exists, right? The universe without human beings, the Big Bang, etc., it still exists outside the human mind. But on the other hand, the way we can perceive reality is through our perceptions. So that comes to the subjective side of reality. So let's say if you are that person, you no longer have perception anymore. So that means the reality doesn't exist for you as a person. So for me, reality has two sides, the objective and subjective side.
I really like that. On that last point, did you say if you're a dead person, then your reality ceases to exist subjectively?
I think so.
Okay, interesting. I'm hoping to do that in another podcast, actually, this question of does our objective or subjective reality actually cease after we die? Because I think that's a whole other thing. But I really like the way that you frame that, the idea that you've got the objective versus the subjective. So the idea that there's something real for everybody in terms of objective, and then subjective, it's more your own personal conscious experience of the thing. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay, so I think that gets to the heart of what's going on and what this question is connected with, which is the whole mystery of consciousness, which again, I think is probably worth exploring in another podcast, but we can definitely bring it in here because that's one of the things that's inherently tied to this.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I think that's a good way of thinking about it. In terms of my own opinion, we can go by the classic dictionary definition of reality, which is the state of things as they actually exist, but it doesn't actually give us much information. So it's worth kind of diving in because people have different opinions on that, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here discussing this. So cool. Okay. So should we start with like where this idea broadly comes from? Like, who would you say is the first major philosopher to introduce this idea that what we experience now might not actually be true reality?
Well, I think definitely your background already revealed that, which is the Plato's cave allegory. I don't know whether he's the earliest one who kind of proposed the idea of a simulation of a world that you probably don't know because you're just too limited, right? Within your small world, just like the people in the cave, they spend their whole life looking at the shadows on the wall. And when someone finally got out to see the world outside, and then when he brings that information back to the people still in the cave, they don't believe him. And then they kind of scold him as like an insane.
Yes.
So I think that's probably, as far as I know, the earliest idea of reality of simulation.
Yeah, I think you're right. And even if he's not the first person to officially introduce the idea, he's definitely the most influential. So there might have been people before who were highlighting, maybe there's definitely people before Plato, philosophers before Plato, who are highlighting the fact that this reality, if you want to call it that, is constantly changing and therefore might not be that reliable a source of truth, if we can call it that. But he's definitely the most influential. So we can start with this allegory of the cave. So like you said, you've got a bunch of prisoners who are tied up, chained in a cave, and they're forced to look at shadows on the wall. And they're going about thinking that's reality, essentially. And then, as you can see in my background, one of the prisoners escapes. And like you say, when he comes back to try to tell everybody that there's this world outside of the cave, which is really amazing, and it's so much better, and it's so much more real, that people think he's crazy. And in some cases might even try to kill him, right?
Yeah.
So cool. Okay. So what do you think Plato was trying to get across in this allegory?
I think definitely he wants to question the definition of reality, right? There are like two realities in this story. One is for the prisoners in their small cave. That is the reality for them. And then the other reality is outside the cave, this much bigger world. So these are the two realities. I feel like that exists at the same time. But it's interesting that the people, the prisoners in the cave, they don't believe in the existence of the other reality because they're just too accustomed to the reality they are already experiencing, and also due to lack of experience of the other reality.
Yes.
So I feel like that's one of the key things he wants to convey through this allegory, to question maybe there's double reality and also this kind of subjectivity of reality.
Yes, and that is actually a really good link to what you said right at the beginning, this idea that we can split reality into two. So you've got your subjective reality, which you think is real, but then there's a reality that's even more real than that. So
exactly. What about you? What do you think the main idea that Plato tries to talk about in this allegory?
Good question. I think as it pertains to the question we're looking at today, you've hit the nail on the head. He's trying to convey the idea that this world is not real and there's another world that's more real, which is known as the world of forms. I actually think you can read it in a lot of other ways as well. And this is where it becomes so wonderful to study, and it's really complex. And I must say, I enjoy this allegory so much more than I did when I was at school, because when I was first introduced to this at school, Mr. Cruz, if you're listening, that was my philosophy teacher. Thank you for introducing me to this idea. But I thought it was crazy. I thought it was absolutely bonkers. You know, I was like, where the hell is he getting these ideas from? These are nuts. But actually, when you tie it into his theory of the soul and his ideas about the afterlife and reincarnation and all those other things, it actually, I think, links to those ideas really nicely. So, for example, because I think the other thing that's connected to this question of what is reality is what are we as human beings? And we can tie that into questions of like consciousness and things like that. But one way of looking at it is that the prisoner who leaves the cave, it could be seen as a kind of metaphor for the soul leaving the body upon death. So that's pretty interesting. Yeah. So if there is this other, it is very interesting. So if there is this other reality, it might be one that's only accessible to our soul, not to our body. Because Plato had a very low view of the body. He thought that the body was an endless source of trouble, that, you know, by the mere requirement of food, right? The fact that we constantly need feeding and the body decays and it changes, whereas the soul is the essential and eternal part of us that isn't corruptible, essentially. So I think you can tie it into that. I think you could also see it as an allegory for what happened to Socrates, his teacher. So the fact that Socrates, in the same way that the prisoner is treated really badly when he goes back and tries to tell everybody, these ordinary people, the prisoners, about reality, same thing happened to Socrates. He was persecuted for his philosophical teaching. So it could be seen as hinting at that. Like, some people think that the actual prisoner is meant to be Socrates himself. So that's one reading. So I think there's lots of different ways you could look at it. But I think you're right. I think he's positing the existence of a dual reality, but he's very clear on the idea that the world outside of the cave is superior.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. And back to the point previously mentioned about the body and soul, I feel that can definitely be a separate podcast where we can dive deeper, because
100%.
Personally, I don't believe in the existence of soul. But yeah, that can be another topic.
Interesting. Okay. So, well, that leads me on to my next question. So does that affect your lack of belief in a soul, let's say? Does that affect how much credence you would give this allegory? Like, do you think that he's onto something by talking about this other reality? Do you think that there is actually another world out there that we can't access with our senses? Or
yeah, that's a really intriguing question. Well, again, I believe that human perception is really limited. So I can't say whether there is another reality outside what I can perceive, right?
Yes.
And as you said, whether there's really a soul that my perceptions cannot perceive. So I would put it as a question mark, as something I don't know. I cannot comment, because just my lack of experience and my lack of perception of the superior whatever world it calls.
Yes.
So, yeah.
That's totally fair enough. If anything, I think that's a really sensible position to take, because you're acknowledging that might not be something that you can comment on because of those limitations. And I think a lot of people would agree. Interesting. Okay. So should we talk a little bit about how Plato's work influenced the likes of, well, first of all, other philosophers, but second of all, like movies, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about your virtual background and how that ties into all of this?
I don't know how many of you have already seen the movie Matrix, but basically it describes a future world where the AI, the machine, dominated the humans, and then they create this kind of illusion for the humankind. And in reality, again, quote unquote reality, all of the people, they're laying in a bathtub, right? And then their brain is connected to a machine that simulates another reality for them, kind of like in a dream, where they are maybe living happily, they're having delicious food, whereas they're just lying in that bathtub. So that is the story of Matrix, right? It talks about, again, dual reality. One in their mind, in their dream, the other where they just lie in the bathtub.
Yeah, amazing. It's such a good film, isn't it? And it's one that was super popular when it came out and still is. So yeah, definitely worth a watch if anybody here hasn't seen it before. Another film that I've seen, have you ever watched The Truman Show?
Of course, yeah. Everyone is watching his life, right? But he doesn't know that he's being filmed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another great film. Again, would highly recommend. There's a couple of others that I want to draw people's attention to as well for anyone who's interested. So we were talking earlier about The Soul, and there was a Pixar movie that came out, I think it was in
Oh yeah,
2020.
so as well. It's called So.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's a great one. And I think that is, whether consciously or not, very much influenced by Plato as well and his theory of the soul.
Mm,
So the idea that we've lived these other lives, or rather our souls have, and then they enter the body when we live
right,
our earthly life.
exactly.
Again, something we can explore more when we talk about the soul in a separate
Yeah.
podcast. The other one I want to talk about is Free Guy. Have you seen that?
Not really. What is it about?
Okay, so it's the whole video game idea. And if you're happy to, I'd like to talk about that a little bit as well. And we can tie that in maybe with Nick Bostrom's simulation argument, because a lot of people have drawn a link there.
Yeah.
But essentially, Free Guy is about an open world game. I think I'm right in saying that. And the characters are all off doing their thing. And then one of them becomes conscious, basically, and he realizes that he's in a video game.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's about the after effects of that, which I'd like to come back to, because one of the things that I think a lot of people raise when they think about this question of, are we living in the real world? What is reality? Is would it matter if we were not? Like, what would the actual implications of that be? So maybe we can come back to that. But I don't know, are you a video gamer? Do you like video games?
Well, not really, but I do have experience with virtual reality games.
Yeah,
Yeah, you just feel
cool.
like you're really immersed in a different world. You have superpower, you can do whatever you want. So I feel like that probably is a realistic simulation of
Yes.
another reality, right? That
Yeah.
is already accessible in our life.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is where, people like Nick Bostrom, who, for those that don't know, is an Oxford philosopher who wrote a paper back in 2003, Are We Living in a Computer Simulation? And he essentially said that even if we can't prove it for sure, it's highly probable that we are. You can actually look at the development of video game technology, which has been incredibly rapid in the scheme of things. People like Elon Musk, for example, have said that, pretty soon video games are going to become indistinguishable from reality. So all of these things kind of overlap with, I think, the idea of the simulation argument and the idea that actually, yeah, maybe this isn't a real world, because look how easily, relatively speaking, we've been able to create worlds that are, not real, right? But look real, but feel real. And especially when you tie that into VR, that adds a whole other dimension to it. So do you want to talk a little bit about Nick Bostrom's argument and why some people have taken it seriously, even though it sounds absolutely crazy?
Yeah, I think his theory is that, let's imagine there's a very advanced civilization that have that technology, right, to create a simulation that's so real that you cannot distinguish with what the reality world is. Yeah, so that is kind of a hypothesis he has, right? And then once you are in the simulation, how can you be aware that in a simulation it's not the real thing?
Yes.
Just like Matrix, how can a person in the Matrix world recognize I am not in my dream or I'm in my dream? How can you tell the difference?
Yes, well, that's another great point. And in a way, I've skipped a little bit, because one philosopher that we could bring in for that argument is René Descartes, because he made that exact same point. He said there are no kind of reliable means by which I can test whether I'm awake or asleep. And that's the whole dream argument, which is very much connected to this as well. So brilliant. Okay, so there's that side of it. And you can tie that into the simulation argument very, very directly, I think. Speaking of this idea that we can't tell the difference, again, something Elon Musk said and something that Bostrom suggested as well, do you think there's any way that we could realistically test this idea of whether or not this world is real?
Oh, that's really hard. I feel like, well, one kind of simulation we're actually experiencing every day, that is dreams.
Yeah.
It's another simulation, right, of another reality in your subjective mind. So the way you can tell whether you're in a dream is that, well, it's actually very hard, because think about the movie Inception. How can the people tell I'm in a dream or not, right? There's another simulation, actually. But okay, one way to tell whether you're a dream or not, you just pinch yourself, whether you feel the pain. If you don't feel, okay, then probably you're in a dream, right? So I feel like that's actually a very down to the earth way of a simulation in our reality that we experience every day, and how you can tell whether you're in a dream, in a simulation or not. But when it comes to the bigger idea, like this kind of AI or VR, or maybe like a machine dominated simulation, I think it's really, really hard to tell. Because if you're in a simulation, probably there will be another bigger simulation outside of you. So it's kind of like begging the question.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, it's interesting actually, because I want to address the dream point again and then come back to this idea of, can we test this broader idea that we're in a simulation? So the dream one, yeah, the classic kind of answer to that is the one that you gave, which is that you could pinch yourself. The issue with that becomes when you think about the fact that actually you could dream that as well. So you could dream that you're pinching yourself.
True.
It gets more complicated when we bring in the concept of lucid dreaming, whereby you're having a dream when you're in control of what's happening. And that's, you know, probably not as typical as a kind of standard dream. But the other thing about dreaming as well is that the part of your brain that checks facts and reality, if we can call it that, the prefrontal cortex, isn't actually active. So that's why you can have a dream about something crazy, like being chased by zombies, and not think it's weird. You know,
that's another good point. Yeah, whether it's really off the reality, whether it's something that's realistic to happen, right?
Yeah,
a good way to tell whether you're in a simulation or a dream or not.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the lines get blurred, because normally, and Inception makes this point actually, to go back to the film you mentioned, it's only when you wake up that you realize something was off normally when you're having a dream. You know, when you're having the dream, it feels normal, it feels real.
That's true. Yeah, like in hindsight, right? You realize that's something really impossible to happen. But when you're in the dream, you just take it for granted.
Exactly. You really do think you're being chased by zombies in the woods or whatever crazy scenario is happening. Yeah, for sure. So there's that side of it, which is complicated. You can also add into it the complication of having a dream within a dream, or like you say, there being a simulation within a simulation. So that's the idea that, you know, it's kind of what we're doing now. Like, if we are in a simulation, if we're creating video games, then that is a simulation within a simulation kind of thing. The other thing to think about is, again, it's a big if, but if we are in a simulation, who's running it? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think people would just say the God.
Yeah.
Give it, because you don't know who that person is, but that creature must be supernatural, right? Or at least way more advanced than human beings. So yeah, an easy answer to that, the God.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people would talk about God, or whatever we want to define God as. And again, I'm hoping to do that in a separate podcast. The other thing as well is, I mean, the fact that we're even having this conversation if we're in a simulation is kind of weird, because it suggests that there's been something in us that's been programmed, perhaps, for want of a better word.
Yeah, that's another so good point, like free will versus predeterminism, right? If we're in a simulation, that means there's already a program about what is going to happen. That means you don't have free will. Everything is already predetermined for you. But again, there's another, a lot of philosophers debating about the free will versus predeterminism. Which one is like the truth in our world? Yeah, it's just like two complicated ideas around this reality simulation topic.
Yeah, 100%, because like many other big philosophical questions, this question connects with so many others, and it gets us thinking about so many others as well. And that being one of them, which again, we'll have to tackle
talk about in the
separately
future.
For sure. Yeah, but it is very, very much tied into that. So something to think about then is, first of all, is there any test that can be done? And people have suggested things like, well, sometimes the world glitches, right? Like, I'm on a Facebook group at the moment, and people are constantly putting up pictures like, the sky looks really weird today, must be a glitch in the matrix, stuff like that, right? But the other thing that's been put forward, which is a very, interesting idea, I think, is that, well, first of all, like, why would we even be talking about this? Surely the programmers or God, whoever's in charge of the simulation, probably wouldn't want us to know that we're in one. But the fact that we're even talking about this suggests that, either our programming's gone wrong or this was part of our programming. So the motives behind doing that are pretty unclear. Second of all, if we did get to a point where we discovered this, I mean, maybe that has happened in the past, that we've discovered the reality, reality is not what we think it is. The programmers could just wipe our memory, surely. So
exactly,
there's kind of no end to the number of complications with this idea of being able to test it, really. So we're getting towards the end now, but my last for the last 5 minutes or so, I want to focus on this question of, does it even matter? Like, if we were to discover that this world that we live in is not real, I mean, let's ask you personally, would you change your behavior on a kind of day-to-day basis? Like, would you go out and do something crazy? Would you start to think that none of this matters? Or how would you respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends what your life goal is, really, whether being in a simulation really affects your goal of your life. So for me, I don't mind if I'm living in a simulation, as long as I can still fulfill my dreams, my goals. I don't care. Yeah. And actually, back to Matrix, I believe one of the scene is that a very famous one, you're offered with two pills, the
Yeah.
blue one or the red one, right? I believe the red one is the cruel reality. You're lying in a bathtub, but that's the real world. And the blue one is the simulation. You're living a happy, fulfilling life. Which one would you choose, Rosanna?
Oh, that's a great question. This reminds me, I don't know if you've got this far in the Pig That Wants to Be Eaten book, but this reminds me of, and I think you know it anyway, Robert Nozick's thought experiment about the pleasure machine.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I
That's it.
think I'd rather live in the real reality rather than the simulated one.
Why is that? You would prefer to suffer
Yeah,
because it's just real.
yeah, good question. Like, why would anyone consciously choose that?
Yeah.
I think it ties in with the meaning of life, which I will address
Right.
in another episode. This idea that, you know, we have in our heads, like we just, you know, when people talk about the meaning of life, they're like, I just want to be happy, right? And it's like,
Right.
it doesn't really work like that in reality, first of all. And I think many people, and Nozick comes to this conclusion in his thought experiment, what matters more is living a real meaningful life than it does to just live a life of constant
With pleasure.
but fake pleasure, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
The source of what is causing you to feel a certain way matters to people. Clearly, it's not just the end result. So it's kind of a way to dismiss the notion that, you know, all that matters is the consequences of something. I don't think that is all that matters to most people. But I like this idea. It's really interesting that you said, you know, I don't really mind if I'm in a simulation. And I think it's something that a lot of people could agree with. I remember having this conversation a while ago with my friend, and he said, yeah, you know, maybe we are living in a simulation, but I've still got to pay my bills tomorrow. So, you know, I quite liked that idea that actually we sometimes think that if we were to find out that this world isn't real, we're not real, perhaps, you know, connected to that, because it does tie into the nature of what we are or who we are as humans. You know, people often jump to the conclusion that, oh, okay, well, nothing matters, and they become somewhat nihilistic. But actually, I don't think that most people do come to that conclusion, because when I've done this class with students before, I say to them, you know, if you were to find out right now that this is all fake, none of it's real, there's another world out there that's more real than this, would you suddenly stop doing your homework? Would you suddenly, you know, like go on a crime spree, like do whatever? And they're all like, no, I just carry on as I am because I don't want to hurt people, right? So it's really interesting, because even if it's fake, there's still this feeling of, well, it feels real to me, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I want to actually play a clip, if it's all right with you, from Free Guy, the movie I
Let's do
mentioned
that.
earlier.
Let's do that.
There's a conversation they have about this, and basically the character that acquires consciousness, sorry, slight spoiler alert here, says to his friend, you know, what happens if none of this is real? If you were to find out that you're not real right now, like, how would that affect things? And yeah, this is how the conversation goes. So this is the friend here responding.
I'm me, who I am right now, and I'm just trying to help a friend. I say, okay, so what if I'm not real?
I'm sorry. So what?
Yeah, so what?
But if you're not real, doesn't that mean that nothing you do matters?
What does that mean? Look, brother, I am sitting here with my best friend trying to help him get through a tough time, right? And even if I'm not real, this moment is. Right here, right now. This moment is real.
Okay, so I thought...
Beautiful. I love that. This moment is real.
Exactly. And that's the thing. And, you know, maybe it is a case of just taking it moment by moment. And I wouldn't want to look at that and think, oh, well, okay, none of it matters, so therefore it's not worth discussing. I do think it's worth discussing 100%.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure you'd agree. But I think it's a good note to end on, actually, this idea that, you know, regardless of what's going on in the broader scheme of things, you know, this conversation,
the moment's real.
The moment's real. I'm here with a friend. We're talking about a really interesting topic, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So cool. I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for joining, Jan. You've been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you,
I'd definitely love to get
me.
you. Yeah, no worries. I'd definitely love to get you back on to discuss an array of different topics.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Cool. But yeah, we'll leave it for now. And yeah, looking forward to speaking soon. Do you want to talk a little bit about your platform where you discuss these kinds of things with your students as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, for those who don't know, I am building a virtual, it's a virtual classroom again.
Very appropriate.
It's a gamified virtual classroom to make online tutoring as fun as a game. So yeah, myself, I'm also an online tutor for 8 years, and I'm mainly teaching like similar to Rosanna, very young children, aged 8 to 12 years old, and just find such a challenge to use Zoom or other meeting platforms to teach such young kids. So that's why I came up with this idea using gamification to make online learning as fun as a game. So basically the concept that students can raise and evolve a virtual digital pet who will be their learning companion in the learning experience, and the students can just earn the points from the class for their learning progress or efforts from the teacher. Yeah, so that is the basic idea of Funclass. It's the key essence is really to make online tutoring more motivating, more engaging for our young children. So yeah, so that is my platform, and it's just called Funclass, as you see, the idea just to make class fun, right? So, and I know, Rosanna, you've been using Funclass with a student, and I see they love that. And yeah, if you don't mind, you can also talk a little bit about your experience of using Funclass.
Of course, yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's very much achieved its aims of making lessons more engaging and age appropriate as well, because Zoom, great for conversations like this, but not so much for teaching groups of young children. So it's a fantastic platform for anyone who's teaching or tutoring online younger kids. Then I would highly recommend it. And I will put some links in the description for this video so that they can go and check it out. But anyway, I'll let you go, Jan. Thank you so much again for joining, and look forward to seeing you again on here soon.
Thank you so much, Rosanna, for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jan. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Rosanna.